Hello everyone, my name is Andy Huang. I'm a cloud solution architect, and today we will be talking about GitHub Copilot. So for those of you who are not familiar with what GitHub Copilot is, in a nutshell, it helps you write code. And it does this by taking the context of what you're trying to do through comments or code snippets that you've already written, and it then creates a suggestion based on what it thinks you're trying to accomplish. So Copilot helps you in a few ways. It converts comments to code. So you get to describe the logic that you're trying to accomplish in that comment, and then Copilot will then take those comments and provide code suggestions to help you. This is also a way for you to continue with good practices, such as commenting your code. How often do we go into an application code and see just a bunch of code in there with no comments of what the developer was thinking or what they were trying to accomplish at that time? So I find that when I use Copilot myself, I tend to add more verbose comments to my application or my scripts. Another thing it does is it autofills repetitive code. So it helps you quickly produce boilerplate code or fill in repetitive code patterns. So if you're entering in a bunch of variables and it starts noticing what you're doing, maybe you're spinning up some infrastructure in Azure and it notices, hey, it knows what you're trying to do. It knows that you just defined some variables for your location or your resource group names. It might also make some suggestions on subscription names, for example. Or maybe you're making a request to an API and it sees that you're making the request and may also suggest some ways of error handling. And lastly, it will also show alternatives. So it doesn't just provide one suggestion, it can provide multiple suggestions. And that way you can filter through and see which one actually fits what you're trying to do. Now, if you see on the image on the right-hand side, you'll see that on lines 5 and 6, there are some comments that the developer is trying to do. Line 7, the developer is starting to write their function. And lines 8 through 17 are what Copilot is now making a suggestion based on what it sees you're trying to accomplish. Another thing that you might have noticed is that this is all within the IDE. So there's no context switching. You're not switching from your IDE to a browser to Google search or search Stack Overflow for something. You're not opening up another application for Copilot. It's all built into your IDE. Now, naturally, with all these features, it's going to give your developers a huge advantage. But we'd like to highlight a few specific advantages that it helps with. First is it naturally increases developer productivity. Developers should be able to code faster with suggestions from Copilot. But there's also a secondary benefit that we find, which is that developers are also happier. And that is because they're now able to solve challenging problems and not just work on boilerplate code. It also is beneficial because they can just focus on the cool stuff. Next, it also accelerates innovation. You can now prototype and innovate more rapidly because Copilot can help you with those scenarios. Imagine if you have an application that you're maintaining and now you want to integrate with a new Azure service. You've never used this new Azure service before, so you're kind of prototyping what this might look like. Copilot can help you in those scenarios to help you prototype faster, test quickly, fail fast, and see what makes sense. And lastly, it can also bridge skill gaps. So Copilot can help developers learn and practice new languages, for example. This is great when you're transitioning from maybe one language to another. I know in the past for myself, I knew how to use Azure ARM templates and I wanted to learn Terraform as well. And I knew the concepts of infrastructure code and what resources I needed to spin up my environment. I just didn't know how to do that in Terraform. So unfortunately, I didn't have Copilot back then, so I had to constantly reference the Terraform documentation. But this is a scenario where I could have described what I wanted to do, and Copilot could have helped me create some suggestions from there. Now, because of these benefits, I think there are some other benefits that you'll start noticing as well, which is helping with best practices. I mentioned earlier that, of course, adding more comments into your code is a good best practice, but also writing more tests is also a great best practice. And generally speaking, I don't know a lot of developers that really focus and love writing tests. They want to work on those challenging problems. But having Copilot can help you write more tests faster because of those suggestions that they've made. And lastly, I also like to mention that all languages are covered. Naturally, the more popular languages have more suggestions, but this also means that it's not just only focused on developers. We can also think about the operations teams. They may be writing shell scripts or PowerShell scripts. Maybe they're creating their infrastructure with infrastructure as code with Bicep or ARM or Terraform. And Copilot can help you in those scenarios as well. Now, we've talked about the benefits, but how do we quantify the benefits? So from there, the GitHub team has surveyed more than 2,000 developers to learn about the developers' experience leveraging GitHub Copilot. And here are some of the numbers that they found. For 96% of the developers say that they are faster with repetitive tasks. 88% say that they are more productive, and 74% say that they are able to focus on more satisfying work. Now, I've been saying faster this whole time, and again, how do you quantify how much faster? So on top of that, there was another study done where they recruited 95 developers and split them into 2 random groups. They were tasked with writing a web server in JavaScript. And on the left-hand side, you'll see that 45 got to use GitHub Copilot, and the right-hand side, 50 did not get to use it. 70% of the developers who used Copilot completed the task, and 70% of the 50 developers did not. But the biggest difference that we saw here is the amount of time on average it took them to complete this. So for the developers leveraging GitHub Copilot, they spent on average 1 hour and 11 minutes to complete the task, whereas those who did not took 2 hours and 41 minutes. And that's 55% less time when leveraging Copilot, which is just an amazing statistic. Another great thing is that you can use the editor of your choice. So this is not just on VS Code and Visual Studios. You can, if you want to code on a browser, you can leverage GitHub Codespaces, or if you like, you can also leverage JetBrains or NeoVim. Now let's go into a little bit more detail on how Copilot works. So once enabled, Copilot will grab the context. In this case, it might be comments or some of the code snippets, and it'll provide that context to Copilot, which will leverage OpenAI Codex model. It then will return the suggestion to your editor, where you get to then choose if you want to accept or ignore the suggestion. Copilot gets the context from local files, so not the repository, which means that you don't have to use GitHub to store your code to leverage Copilot. Copilot only shares the data in an ephemeral way. So just enough to make a suggestion, and then once it's done making the suggestion, it is then removed. We like to think of GitHub Copilot as a way to enhance your day-to-day work. Accountants don't just crunch numbers in their head all day. They leverage calculators so they can be more productive. And we think of Copilot as a similar way for developers. Now, there are 2 different SKUs for GitHub Copilot. There are Copilot for individuals and Copilot for business. Copilot for individuals are for those developers who are just coming right in on their own individual account and just paying for the service. All of the features that we've been talking about so far cover Copilot for individuals. For our partners, I imagine we'll be mainly focused on Copilot for business for our partners and their customers. It includes all the features in Copilot for individuals, but it also, on top of it, encompasses license management and also organizational-wide policy management. And we'll go into those details in a little bit. For individuals, it is $10 a month or $100 per year, a year. Whereas for Copilot for Business, it is $19 per user per month for qualified GitHub Enterprise Cloud businesses. Now, let's talk about a little bit on the individual controls. So as a developer, you are in control of when you use GitHub Copilot. So you can enable or disable it right in your IDE. You can also share code snippets or choose not to by opting out of that telemetry. And there's also a feature called public code matches, where the suggestions that Copilot is about to make will be checked across public code. And if there is a match, it will not suggest that to you. For Copilot for Business, there is the policy control at an organizational level, so that filtering public code feature can be enabled across. And it also allows ease of use to assign licenses to your users. And of course, it still has the public code match filtering feature as well. So I'd like to end with talking over about the advantages one last time, as these are the main points that we'd like to share. Being able to increase developer productivity and satisfaction. Going back to that study that I shared earlier, developers are 55% faster at completing tasks when leveraging Copilot. They're also able to accelerate innovation, so testing out those new ideas, those new proof of concepts at a faster rate, because Copilot is able to assist them in those areas. And lastly, being able to bridge skill gaps by learning new languages or new techniques. I always like to share that things are always changing in this space, and Copilot will help with that adoption at a faster rate. Thank you everyone for joining me today, and have a good day.